Someone here is committed to the view that ethical principles are generated in some metaphysical realm prior to the beginning of space and time. Alternatively, are there certain guiding human values, such as human flourishing or meeting people's basic needs, that emerge in any and all sustainable cultural contexts? And I think there are. I think there are things that every human being needs in order to survive and hopefully thrive if we had the right kind of world. But even if such ethical commonalities exist, their existence in no way guarantees their uniform interpretation, let alone actual implementation. So even if there are these commonalities, it's another thing to interpret them and apply them, and so on. For a theory of global bioethics to become the practice of global bioethics, we need to build into that theory two things: critical lenses clear enough to recognize unjust power relations that result in human domination and subordination, whether it's based on gender, race, class, ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation, or so on. And two, motivational force strong enough to get people to actually do that, to eliminate the unjust power structures. And I maintain that in most ethical theories, there's not nearly enough emphasis on motivation. How do you actually motivate people to do the right thing rather than just to know it? So like all feminist approaches to bioethics, if I'm going to be talking about a feminist bioethics, it has to be meet certain conditions. And the first of those conditions is must provide a moral critique of actions, practices, systems, structures, and ideologies that perpetuate the oppression, damaging subordination of women and other groups that suffer comparable or even worse treatment. So once again, I'm referring to maybe sexual orientation or race or disability can result in a worse kind of oppression than gender. It depends on where you are and where you live and how people respond and so on. Secondly, it has to consider morally justifiable ways to resist the economic, social, and cultural causes of the oppression. Are you going to resort to violence, or are you going to try to do some other things short of violence? And three, imagine morally desirable alternatives to the present world, which to a greater extent, depending where we live, is still sexist, racist, classist, elitist, ageist, heterosexist, ethnocentric, and or colonialist. And you see the residual of colonies more, let's say, in Europe than elsewhere. We were only a colony of England, and that didn't last that long. And four, transform the present world into a future world in which today's oppressed people can thrive. And that's the most difficult of all. And as yesterday I mentioned, the countries that I feel are most oppressed are African countries, largely. I mean, certain ones are relatively okay. And we can ask ourselves why Africa remains the dark continent, and so on. Interestingly, most feminists in the Western world initially sought to achieve the goals of feminist bioethics or ethics. You can substitute ethics for bioethics whenever I say that, by stressing women's sameness to men. They thought that was the way to go. But the weaknesses of this approach rapidly became apparent. First, by insisting that women can measure up to men, feminists inadvertently conceded that men and men's traditional ways of being in the public world were somehow better than women's traditional ways of being in the world. So there was a concession, hey, women should be like men. And secondly, the reality is that there are significant differences between men and women. And we could have a debate whether they're physiological, biological, psychological, or whatever, but there do seem to be differences, at least once we get into the area of reproduction. There are. Acknowledging that it was probably a mistake to stress sameness and to deny difference from men, many feminists began to present women's ways of being, thinking, and doing not only as different from men, but sometimes as neo-Nazi, as somehow better than men. The male-female difference, however, in this approach was stressed so much that women's differences from each other weren't acknowledged. I mean, the whole, what could I say, focus was how do men and women differ, and many women in the Western world weren't looking at how they differed from women in other countries and in other environments and so on, not failing to recognize their own privileges, their own kind of domination of women, let's say, in developing countries as opposed to developed countries. And gradually, from this idea of differences among women, the idea of woman, you know, in the singular, was rejected as an essentialist idea that was really, when woman was being said, it meant a certain kind of woman, relatively affluent, white, from the developed country, and probably affluent in some degree of the sense of that term. At first, it might seem ethically counterintuitive to reject the all-encompassing idea of woman. It's in women's interest to do X, or it's in women's interest to do this other thing. After all, the idea of human sameness has brought about many progressions in the world. Yet, upon careful reflection, it becomes possible to see how the idea of human sameness can function oppressively and even arrogantly. Philosopher Elizabeth Spellman notes, for example, how in his concern to overcome mid-1950s racial barriers in the US, a historian named Kenneth Stamp wrote, and you know, he was doing this, he was trying to be enlightened. He wrote, quote, that innately Negroes are, after all, only white men in black skins, nothing more, nothing less. And he meant that as a compliment. Down deep, they're just like us. He didn't think, though, as some feminists who critiqued him, it's why can't you say that down deep to the white men, that you're really, you know, a black man in white man's skin, and that it's really good to be a black man. So you could see how the idea of sameness can have an oppressive thing, even when you're trying to say something, quote unquote, enlightened. Spellman's point and points like this prompted a major change in feminist thought. The idea of women's differences and people's differences replaced the idea of people's sameness. In the 1980s and 1990s, feminists in the developed countries converted quickly to the idea of difference, so much so because they did not want to be viewed as absolutists or as colonialists, disrespectful of people's diversities and cultures. Indeed, for fear of denigrating or demeaning the other, the marginalized, and so on, this group of feminists refused to condemn systems, institutions, and/or practices in developing nations which they would condemn in their own nation. All right, so they went so far, you know, they were going towards relativism at this point to say, well, maybe we can understand female genital mutilation or female cutting, as it's now called, in context, all right? But we certainly wouldn't allow it here. Right? And so some women in those developing contexts said something like, I don't want it either. You know what I mean? I'm a voice of resistance to that practice within my own culture. Please don't say that, you know, you can understand what I want. That's not what I want. It's what has accrued in this particular culture as a result of many, many years of relationships of gender and sexuality. So what was threatening about this emphasis on diversity, you know, we're all different, we all have different practices, women are very, very, very different, and so on. We were losing a basis for feminist action. Because if you can't say something like, women have certain rights, or women have, you know, certain goals, or something like that, you lose the basis of action, because there's no collectivity to make it flow. So how are they going to solve that? Because of everything claimed so far, it becomes clear that even in these postmodern times, it remains important not to reject the search for sameness in diversity or diversity in sameness. There must be a way to accommodate both of those bipolarities and to somehow mediate between them. This cautionary call was first answered by feminists who saw in human rights the kind of universality that they were looking for. And human rights, women's right talk, that type of phraseology actually did help women get certain things across the board. And it was a powerful language. But there are many ways to critique it. In the first way, usually rights language, at least how it's formulated in the Western world, stresses negative rights over positive rights. In other words, it's much more easy to respect your, oppression from governmental interference with liberty, thought, of action, than to supply you with the material conditions you need to thrive as a human person. I mean, yeah, I can respect your freedom. It doesn't cost me anything, you know. But am I willing to contribute dollars and programs and institutions to actually let you take advantage of that freedom? Freedom isn't very much to have if you don't have any context in which to apply it. And second, rights talk was criticized sometimes, this is by feminists also, because it sometimes weren't really universal rights. It was once again reverting back to the rights of, I should say, women's rights as understood by a certain group of women. And once in a while going back to privileged, white, developed nation, and so on. Ann Phillips points out that the high value placed, for example, on autonomy was one of those fixations of human rights, all right, autonomy, and so on, that was really a product of a preoccupation of Western cultures. Being autonomous, for example, in the USA, when I set those 4 principles of bioethics, autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, they throw in justice every once in a while just to look like good guys or whatever. Autonomy always wins out whenever the principles conflict, even though I sometimes think the result is awful because they didn't take account of these various other principles. She observes that many women do not value personal autonomy and mobility over the ties of family or community, nor do they want to be free from the constraints of tradition, nor do they want to be liberated from the obligations and limitations that go with belonging to a community. So if you're a member of a family, it's not that you want to say, you know, I want to be independent, I don't want anything to do with this family. Most people do, in some way or another, even if they're exerting their own idiosyncrasy and difference and all of that. Those kinds of ties and connections for many human beings, or should be for human beings, important. In the realm of Western bioethics, patient autonomy, and I mentioned this already, is so highly valued that most ethicists cannot understand why a patient might truly want her family to decide her course of treatment. You know, it's like, no, she has to, or he has to decide what's in his or her own best interest. Now, growing up in a tightly knit Czech community, that's how I grew up in the USA. My mother and father were from the former Czechoslovakia. I still have trouble not thinking of it that way, but that's what they were from. And I remember my grandmother asking my mother to decide if she should undergo chemotherapy for leukemia. I also remember my mother asking my father, you know, what to do. And I was even consulted about, you know, what was best for my grandmother and what I thought she would find most humane in, you know, her last year or so. And in fact, most of our decisions were made jointly. You know, they were made jointly, balancing out different kinds of needs in the family. We struggled, I think, in that Czech community to wear our foreignness, because we were foreign to the mainstream, in dignity in the United States, kind of saying we're proud of who we are and how we relate to each other. So it was a conception of relational autonomy, that in a way, if you assert autonomy in an abstract way, you know, I'm going to chart the course of my own destiny, you're really a very lonely and separate person, all on your own. A third reason I know that I shy away from rights talk is that it tends to drown out responsibilities talk. And that goes back to the first generation and second generation rights. Because I might assert that I have a right to food, but if you don't recognize that right and give me food or whatever, then, you know, it's hollow. You know, you have the right, you have the right. Well, implement it with actual concrete material goods and psychological assistance and so on. Although talking about responsibilities rather than rights makes it more clear that the realization of individual rights is dependent on others' felt responsibilities, that if you have a right, I feel that I have a responsibility to meet it. That, you know, is not natural to many people. Such talk does not explain, however, why individuals may lay claim to some social arrangements, goods, and services, but not to others. In other words, how many rights do I have? How many claims can I justifiably make from you or from a state and so on? And here I realize that many of you are familiar with Sen's work and with Martha Nussbaum's work, basically stressing people deserve from the state whatever it is that will enable them to develop the capabilities they have as human beings. First of all, their capabilities just to survive, all right, as a threshold. And then the capabilities that can make their life not only life, but a good life. And she has her own list. I'll tell you what her list is and then a consideration about it. Her capabilities, as she sees it, includes life, bodily health, bodily integrity, senses, imagination and thought, emotions, practical reason, affiliation, other species, and you know, this is where ecofeminism comes in, play, and control over one's environment. And that's her list of what she views as the capabilities or capacities of people that a state has an obligation, not simply other individuals, but the state, to make their people not only survive, but to thrive. And that's a tall order, you know, especially from some emerging countries that are actually just struggling, if they're wanting to struggle to make people survive. To this, some people, however, have said about Nussbaum's list that it's reflecting not the needs of all women, but once again, the needs or capacities or capabilities of one kind of woman. I mean, when she goes on about imagination and play, people go like, really? That's, you know, I have a right to play? Maybe, I find that in the context of the world, a difficult one to swallow. Although I would say, ideally speaking, it's great to see children playing and, you know, I don't know, me playing or something like that. So she's been criticized too for that. I mean, everybody gets criticized no matter what they try to do, whether it's rights or responsibilities or capacities or capabilities, especially if you're a philosopher, and if you don't think of some critique of all of these ideas, you're a cooked goose. I mean, you're not getting anywhere in the field unless you object to something or another. I mean, there's still that kind of adversarial approach in philosophy that I really don't like, but anyway. But even if Nussbaum's response to that is basically, no, if you would really see how people respond in other countries, you would see that these are things that people want or desire and so on. So she's trying to come back in her own sort of way. But even if her capabilities or capacities approach moves us from a totally abstract, non-relational understanding of human rights to a more contextual, relational interpretation of rights. There's a worry that it could rebound back to abstract universalism. So if neither responsibilities talk nor capabilities talk do the job for us, what about care talk? And that's what I'll kind of go into the second part of my paper. Feminist care-focused bioethics have been articulated in many ways, but in my estimation, a philosopher named Daniel Engster captures their essence. As he sees it, any such ethics requires people to develop those epistemic skills, all right, that good mothers or people who act like good mothers, that would include men who act like good mothers, typically display. For example, attentiveness, responsiveness, and concern. So a great emphasis on epistemic skills, that you really see that as something that needs to be done in a situation, not something that just kind of lushes out or flows over you in some sort of oozy way, but something you think about as being important to your relationships with others. Much in the way that Sarah Rudick reasons in her book Maternal Practice, Engster claims that people with such epistemic skills are better equipped not only to understand what arrangements, goods, and services people actually need to lead fully human lives, but also to fully examine human relationships to see if they are really equal or something that's disguised, looking like equal when it isn't. Thus, those who espouse a feminist bioethics or ethics of care maintain that if a state wants to publicly promulgate rights for women, it must first challenge its people to critically assess the relationships that exist between men and women. So that if a state wants to proclaim women's rights, it's got to first address the actual relations between men and women. And you can substitute racial minorities and the mainstream, and you can do all of that sort of adjustment. Rights talk can go wrong if male-female relationships are not scrutinized. Sir Christina Helston provides a good example of women's right legislation gone wrong for women. She writes as follows: increasing services and benefits to women may backfire if the culture itself has not adopted gender equality in its social structures. For example, the Tanzanian suggestion to change the national laws to give women maternity leave was greeted with concern or worry by many feminists. If women in Tanzania, a still rather patriarchal society, would suddenly receive benefits like maternity leave or some sort of compensation for that, their social position might actually not improve, but rather degrade. The husbands or lovers could force their wives to have more children and then take charge of the money that was brought in by having more children and use it the way they wanted to. Also, women who weren't working out of the home couldn't benefit by maternity leave, but there was paternity leave also for men. So they would take advantage of it and go on vacation. And basically, I don't know what they do in Tanzania, but I know what they would do in the USA. They would be watching football and drinking beer all day long. In the end, it could be seen that men, and not women, in that social context, were the primary beneficiaries of what was meant as a good thing for women. You know, we're giving you maternity leave. But the society was not prepared to understand what that really meant. So to a degree that a feminist bioethics of care strives to make sure that rights talk does not go wrong, as it did in the Tanzanian example, it's an activist ethics. You have to change those social and cultural traditions before you can implement a lot of these great sorts of things. I mean, it's always like the chicken and the egg thing. Some people want to implement the policy and then drag the social and cultural practices to meet the principle. Other people say, no chance that'll happen. You've got to change the social and cultural thing before you can get the principle to work. And what's usually easier is to get the principle, right? Because it's much harder to change or transform the society. So for instance, in her recent book, Ethics of Care, Virginia Held seeks a motivational trigger strong enough to get us to do the hard work necessary to create a just social order for each other. She claims that appeals to self-interest will not do, for if self-interest alone or primarily motivates our caring for each other, we will not actually be engaging in the practice of care. We will be pretending to engage in the practice of care. So for example, in the US, all right, there's currently all of our uninsured people, over 40 million uninsured totally. They don't have what's called Medicare or Medicaid. They have nothing. When they get sick or ill, their court of last resort is go emergency room at a hospital. The hospital is required by law to treat them if they are in an emergent situation. And many of them are because they haven't been taking care of themselves or attended to by a primary care physician. So all their troubles could have been headed off at the past or prevented had they had consistent care all along. They get that care in the emergency room and it costs like you can't believe. Like let's say, all right, I'll tell you, my son who recently had a heart attack, uninsured, I had asked, I said, Paul, let me insure you. He said, no, I'll get it myself. He didn't. He had the heart attack. He came home with one night stay in the hospital. They decided that they could treat it with prescription drugs that had been only mild, and it cost $20,000. You know, I mean, You can see, and that's not a bad bill, you know, in the U.S. But this is what happens if you're on, and so then people are supposed to pay that off an installment plan or something. People who reason, but what then some people say is, okay, it's in our best interest to have universal health care coverage because then those people won't go to the emergency room, jack up the prices of, you know, health care. We can spread it out and distribute it, and the arrogant we, won't have to pay for them. All right, but it's motivated by that kind of thinking. Not that you care about the person who's, you know, dying there in your emergency room. What you really care about is you're not going to have to pay for it, you know, out of extra tax dollars. That's, you know, the U.S.'s problem. Everybody wants everything and nobody wants to pay for it. Maybe it's a problem everywhere, I don't know, but in the U.S. it's a real problem. But if self-interest is not a proper motive for the practice of care, what about a sense of duty? And many people look to Immanuel Kant to see if in his imperfect duty of beneficence that you could generate something like a ethics of care. But really you can't, because in general Kant, although, you know, he was said to have an emotional side and all of that, you cannot find, you know, anything less than a categorical imperative type of approach to care, you know. So, you know, we used to jokingly say, I have a duty to my wife to, you know, have relations, and you know what kind, with her. It is my duty, darling, it is now duty time. You know, I mean, no. Would you want it? You know, I wouldn't. But you can understand what's going on there. So as Held sees it, emotions aren't something you add on, like icing or powdered sugar on a cake. They're constitutive of a good moral act. Emotions aren't something nice. They're like the bread and butter, especially bread, as I've learned in Serbia. But fortunately, I love bread. They are part of what makes a relationship good in a particular situation. Held notes, for example, that going through the motions of a caring, active, dutifully, for instance, feeding an infant, but without any of the appropriate feelings, is not actually to be engaged in the practice of care. More controversially, she maintains that people who are thoroughly insensitive to others' feelings may, as a result of their deficiency, be incapable of leading a fully moral life, their dutiful actions notwithstanding. She wonders if it is at all possible for a person, quote, who has grown up and continued into adulthood with a gross lack of sensitivity to the feelings of others, unquote, to truly care. I mean, that's very controversial stuff to be saying, that unless you're able to muster up caring feelings for other people, you can't view yourself as entirely moral. So you see that's a heavy demand, because many people believe that as long as they do their duty, they're fine. And what she's demanding is that's not enough. You have to do it with the appropriate feelings. You can see why this is feminist in the sense that to the degree that women have been culturally associated or linked to values such as care and concern and all of this type of thing, and emotions, whereas men have been culturally associated with rationality and, you know, justice and all of that, why this would be controversial. Because she's saying, she's rehabilitating once again values and virtues that are culturally associated, for the most part, in different sorts of ways in women. And it differs in cultures. There are some cultures that are really caring, and it doesn't matter about gender. And I've been in some of those. Held goes on to argue that an ethics of care is just as important and applicable in the public world as the private world. She asked an important question, namely, how can we get ourselves to recognize our interdependency, regional, national, and global, so that we can redesign the economic, political, social, and cultural structures that currently make the practice of care and the establishment of a just order, of a just social order so difficult for us. In other words, she's saying, what do we have to do to enable us to care? I mean, there are so many things in society that make it difficult for us to care, whether it's an emphasis on efficiency, whether it's because market values leach over or invade, you know, our other sorts of values. Our worlds, especially our bureaucratic worlds, I would say, I come to hate bureaucracy, basically make it very, very difficult to care. So once again, since this is bioethics or medical ethics, in the medical world in the USA, doctors are encouraged to only see each patient for at most 6 minutes. And why are they doing that? To generate more money for their practice. So the more people you can push through your clinic, the more money you make. Now, once you do that, is there any time to talk? Is there any time to learn about that patient? No. What you're basically saying is, you've got that, I'll fix it, get out of here. Here's your pill, you go home. Oh, you need surgery, come back in 2 weeks. End of story. Health's belief that the drive for profit, power, and prestige makes it hard for people to care about each other and therefore to create a just social order for each other is shared by Fiona Robinson. As Robinson sees it, both rights-based and duty-based approaches to concrete problems like global poverty are too abstract and generalized. She says they do not, quote, take us close enough to mitigating the actual suffering of real people caused by continuing poverty. Poverty in the South is ongoing and part of the everyday lives of those whom it affects. What ethics must do is to begin to make this poverty a part of the everyday lives of those who are at present unaware of the way they may be affected by it. And once again, that's no easy task, to get people who are privileged to basically understand that much of their privilege depends on people being impoverished. I mean, when we think about it that way, you know, I can't help but feeling bad about myself, you know, and so on. But to get that kind of mindset conversion is very, very difficult because people like to think well of themselves, you know. So if you give to a charity cause, you've done your thing for the day or for the year, and now you go back to work, power, prestige, status, climbing the ladder, and so on. Robinson concludes that those who would prefer to cling to the familiar language of rights and duties, justice and reciprocity, and the apparent certainty offered to us by the kind of ethics which tells us what to do and gives us universal standards by which to judge the justice or injustice of all forms of human activity. If you have that type of conception of morality or of ethics, you want absolute rules that you can apply automatically in each situation, then you're going to dismiss care ethics. You're going to dismiss it as, quote, this is from Robinson, sentimental, nepotistic, relativistic, paternalistic, and even dangerous. That's usually the response to anything that feminists have cooked up. You know, it's dangerous to see, at least that, if not more. But the fact that people may criticize an ethics of care is not a reason to abandon it, but it's a reason to make it work in the public world as well as the private world. So rather than taking that as being defeated, to take it as a point of rallying and doing something about it. Perhaps the best way to conclude this paper is by offering an example of how a feminist bioethics of care is more able than a rights-based or duty-based ethics to achieve gender justice in a particular instance. And I'm going to talk about gender justice as opposed to all the other kinds of injustice that we know exists. As the world's population ages and the need for long-term elder care grows, and we know that, that's the demographics of the world, in developing countries as well as developed. New arrangements will need to be made between the government, the individual, and the family, if one exists. You know, if you're lucky enough to have a family, just think about HIV/AIDS, once again in Africa, and how family, you know, your mother's dead, your father's dead, maybe your grandmother's taking care of you, maybe she's dead, maybe you're a child on your own. I mean, the average age in African countries, at least in sub-Saharan Africa, are very, very young. When you have all these young kids, no one taking care of them, you can see what kind of social problems that's going to lead to. So how are governments going to meet all of these long-term elder care needs? Governments must ascertain if their limited funds should be spent more or less on elder care rather than care for some other sections of their population. In addition, individuals should, if possible, set aside money for their long-term elder care and try to preserve their health as best they can. But even if more people reach old age funded, you know, that they have money in the bank, there will still be millions and millions, indeed billions of people who greet old age, if they're lucky enough to get there, with empty wallets. These people will look to their families or family-like persons, that is friends, charitable groups, people who share the same plight, for extra help. As I see it, there are several ways, some bad, others good, to rethink family caregiving responsibilities to elderly family members. This is going to be a growing problem. I mean, in the US, maybe 15, 20 years ago even, it was called the sandwich problem, the sandwich generation, that at the same time you were caring for your own children, you were now having to care for your parents. So if you weren't caring for one, you were caring for the other, and therefore women were tending to drop out of the marketplace. Now that's only going to get worse if people live not into their 70s, but their 80s or 90s, and all the time on TV you see people 100 years old eating their birthday cake. I go, oh boy, you know, how's that going to work? And so on. A recent article on long-term elder care in Japan, where you think, you know, they really do a good job at this thing, well, you'll be surprised, noted that the more the Japanese people adopt market values, the more burdensome and undesirable they view family caregiving. Beginning in 1963, various versions of the Japanese National Survey on Family Planning asked the question, what is your opinion about children caring for their elderly parents? Surveyed individuals could choose one of these four answers: good custom, natural duty, unavoidable, and not a good custom. Between 1963 and 2000, the number of married Japanese women of reproductive age who answered either good custom or natural duty fell from 80% to 47%. During approximately the same period of time, expectations of old age support for one's own children declined from 65% to 13%. So elderly people were they were worried, you know, that, hey, the family doesn't hover around the elderly anymore. So many of us do have the kind of cultural belief that Asian countries have this problem solved totally. Point of fact, once you begin studying them, they don't, and it's really gets crazy. And the article that I was just quoting from concludes this way. Both theory and evidence suggest that the Japanese government's efforts to shift some of the responsibility for caring for the elderly from the Social Security system back to families will not be very successful. Rapid population aging, declines in co-residence, increases in women's education and full-time paid employment, increases in the ratio of impaired elderly to available caregiving givers, and weakening values of filial piety all point to a continuing decline in the ability and willingness of the Japanese family to provide care for the elderly. So the rebellion was first kind of started by Japanese daughter-in-laws. Remember, typically in China and Japan, although the son has the filial duty and you want to have boy babies no matter what, in point of fact, it was the daughter-in-laws who were burdened with caring for their husbands, her husband's parents, and sometimes her own. The article's conclusion may not be accurate. Maybe there is more willingness than their doomsday prediction is. But see, the government, I don't know how your government is right now, but certainly in the USA, the idea is now the people don't want to be taxed, right? So there's a big movement for individual responsibility in healthcare. Everybody's supposed to save enough money to take care of themselves because they're not going to be counting on their family because they're so scattered. And so therefore, that would be individual because the state can't afford it. We're spending close to 18% of our gross national product on healthcare. Really, pretty soon it'll consume 30%. You can't do that forever. There'd be no transportation, no education, you get the idea. But people really can't do that, not with the cost of healthcare the way it is. You can't save enough for that. I figure that on my professor's salary, my retirement, I could exhaust it in 2 years if I had to be in a nursing home. And then I'd be on what they call Medicaid, which is not good. It's bad. So even if some people can do this, a whole lot of people can't. And as bad as it is for women to do too much care work to their own disadvantage, it's even worse if no one at all wants to do care work. Held comments, care, quote, care is probably the most deeply fundamental value. There can be care without justice. There has historically been little justice in the family. Think about your own family. But care and life have gone on without it. There can be no justice without care, however, for without care, no child would survive, and there would be no persons to respect. So you wouldn't even have a reason to worry about being just, because there'd be really no one or such unsocialized people to worry about justice. Similarly, without care, no elderly man or woman, totally bedridden and in need of help, would survive. So what is a better way than neglect or abandonment to meet the long-term elder care needs of elderly people? An obvious way, I suppose, is simply to increase the supply of caregivers, but to do it in such a way that you don't resort to the opportunity of first choice, women, women, women. Drag them, back home and out of the marketplace so they can do care work. Or let them try to do both and get exhausted and, you know, have not a minute to think because they're collapsing at the end of the day. And I'm sure many of you are either in that situation or know about that situation. So what do? I think the challenge of global aging presents a unique opportunity to weaken the two main norms that uphold the world's gender system, namely the ideal worker norm theorized by Joan Williams and the ideal care worker norm alternately celebrated and criticized by feminist care ethicists. Getting rid of the ideal worker norm is no easy matter, however. Chances are, and usually the ideal worker is a man who totally devotes himself, you know, to his job. That's like an idealized, you know, thing that really doesn't exist, but, you know, it's the norm or whatever. Chances are that if one is a man, one's request for family leave or a family-friendly schedule may be met with particular resistance. For example, American men who make their commitments to their families too widely known at the workplace are still viewed with suspicion as not committed workers or as henpecked by their wives. Countries that are really serious about gender equity know that the only way not to marginalize care work is to destroy the ideal care worker norm as well as the ideal worker norm. These countries do not aim to pull women out of the paid workforce so men can stay in it. Instead, they contemplate requiring men to take time off for work to do their fair share. So in Norway, for example, they're thinking of mandatory paternity leave, a paternity leave that men would have to take. I mean, in the US, we have paternity leave, but really few men take advantage of it because they view it as others will say, you know, you're not really committed, da-da-da-da-dum, you know, maternity leaves for women, you know, so on, do it on the weekends, make up for it then or something. So how do we get it that men would do more share of their care work? Men already care for spouses. I was watching, just coming here in the wheelchair or whatever, two couples, you know, in their 80s, you know, with the man basically supporting his wife on his arm. And you could see that he was in relatively good shape and she was failing. So men already do care for spouses. They are starting more than in previous eras, I should say, to care for children. At least they are in the US, and I would imagine that that would be present in other countries too. Therefore, there's no good reason that men cannot also care for parents. To be sure, elder care may be culturally particularly frightening for men. I know, for example, just from my own husband, he is focused as he gets older, he's about 10 years older than me, on degeneration, disintegration, dementia, whatever you want to call it. They all begin with the word D, falling apart, you know, and he almost goes like, oh, woe is me. You know, this is the beginning of the end. I go, Jerry, this is ridiculous. You know, let's just, you know, take this in stride and move on with it. But he, and I believe many men, find the idea of bodies being diminished, disintegrated, and death as threats, particularly to the autonomous self who charts the course of his destiny. The bodies speak of nature, materiality, and that which cannot be controlled, but must instead be accepted. But it is precisely by coming to terms with the reality of enfleshment that men can join with women to overcome the dichotomies that are at the root of job segregation and gender inequity. In order for us to construct just societies in which caregivers do not suffer economically and socially because of the crucial work they do, men must do as much care work as women do. I'm not just saying a little bit, but as much. There are simply too many elderly people with too many needs for women's shoulders to carry them all. Men will need to help or risk finding themselves without adequate care in their old age, because men are living longer too, even though in some countries such as mine, they die a little sooner than women. Only in countries where everyone realizes that they exist in a set of interrelationships that are both nested like a bird's nest and supported by the state, is there any real hope of decreasing each other's vulnerability? I fear that when we may find ourselves alone in our greatest hour of need. Without care, justice will not occur, and without a felt recognition of human need, care will not come alive. Thus, a feminist bioethics or a feminist ethics of care begins with the recognition that we are all vulnerable, that each one of our lives is precarious, and that the only way to globalize any ethics or bioethics is to look each other in the eyes and see ourselves. I thought so.
Ja mislim da je otprilike ovo društvo koje je ostalo na okruglom stolu. Meni je žao što jedan broj učesnika je morao da nas napusti i obzirom na zanimljivo predavanje gospođe Rosemarie Tong, koja je trebalo da otvori ovu konferenciju, ali ovo pitanje okolnosti je sada će biti na zatvaranje, što mislim da s druge strane nije ni loše. Ja sam malo promenila koncepciju ovog okruglog stola, tako da ćete u okviru toga moći da postavljate i pitanja. Ja mislim da sada u prvom delu bi možda bilo dobro da prvo oni koji imaju pitanja postave profesor Tong, pa ćemo mi onda preći na ono što će biti diskusije što smo planirali da bude tema okruglog stola. Da li imate pitanja, komentara?
You can do it whatever you like. You can speak Croatian.
Yeah, I have a translator.
My name is Kruva Juric and I'm from University of Zagreb, Croatia. And I would like to thank you first of all for your extremely interesting and motivating lecture. And I would like to ask you two questions. First question about the very term or concept of global bioethics, and second question about the term or concept of feminist bioethics. My question is the following. Is there any relationship between your concept of global bioethics and the concept of global bioethics by Van Rensselaer Potter?
Oh, yeah.
Van Rensselaer Potter, just a short explanation, was an American scientist, biochemist, and oncologist who coined the very term of bioethics at the beginning of the 70s, as well as he developed the concept of bioethics as a bridge bioethics, and later in his book Global Bioethics, the concept of global bioethics. In Potter's work, global bioethics is universal bioethics, which regards at the same time differences, cultural, national, racial, gender, religious, political, etc. The second meaning of the global bioethics in Potter's work is that global bioethics has to include both biomedical and ecological bioethics, all the topics related to the question of life and the manipulations with life. And the third meaning of global bioethics in Potter's work is that such global bioethics should be globalized or spread all over the world. So there is a kind also of substantial relationship between Potter's global bioethics and feminist or women's perspective in bioethics, because Potter respected it, but I think that he wasn't going deep enough into these problems of feminist perspective, because he took only Gilligan's book in a different voice and said approximately that we should include the women's care, inclusion, emotions, etc. into the general bioethical framework. But I think that he was right when he required an all-comprehensive, universal, integrative concept of bioethics, which would include not only biomedical or human, but also ecological or environmental questions, which include also non-human beings and nature in general. In other words, not only short-sighted perspective of biomedicine or biomedical bioethics, but also long-term view, which is specific to ecological or environmental perspective. Unfortunately, and I'm going to my second question, feminist bioethics sometimes makes the term of bioethics too narrow, thinking that the feminist bioethics means only women's perspective in the issues of medical care or biomedical research, etc. My question is, second question, what about ecofeminism in the framework of feminist bioethics? Is it maybe a part of feminist bioethics? Could it be connected to feminist bioethics, or could it be perceived as the part of feminist bioethics? Because I think that there is a kind of logical and unavoidable connection between human health and life on one hand, and health and life of non-human beings and nature in general on the other hand.
Right. But you want to respond? No. Okay. Now that is a wonderful question. In my book, Feminist Thought, I have a whole chapter on ecofeminism, and I understand totally what you're saying. First, with Potter, in the U.S., you're right. What happened was, after he coined the term, and it was supposed to be, bioethics was supposed to be about the biosphere, understood largely with nature, with animals, with environmental issues, very important environmental issues, sustainability, and all of that. That somehow got weeded out, all right? And they focused then on medical ethics, and lately on research ethics and reproductive and genetic, a lot of stuff on genetic and so on. I think that feminist ethics would naturally, and I guess I'm being redundant here, connect, or, you know, I could give a different talk where I would have, you know, expanded and said that because women have been correlated with nature as well as the body and materiality, that they would, culturally speaking or whatever, be predisposed to environmental issues, to sustainability. Because you're right, without the air, the water, the sanitation, the could I say, capacity to feed animals and so on and so forth, our lives would be shriveled. They would not have any capacity for us at all. So unless we work with nature and get some sort of harmony with nature, instead of trying to dominate nature, which was always the feminist connection, in the same way that, you know, traditionally men dominated women, culture dominated nature, but somehow to have the idea not simply about being wise, stewards of nature, but working with nature cooperatively so that we become friends. And I think that's where your question is going. I really do think that's the case. And you're right, I think sometimes when we're doing feminist bioethics, because there's so much to be said on all the different types, For example, I focus on certain issues, but and I could easily have focused on the others. You know, I happen to really, I shouldn't say like, that's a very weak term. I think ecofeminism is one of the broadest, most expansive forms of bioethics there can be, because it has Potter's original conception. And maybe we can go back to that. I think we might be, because of the greater push towards sustainability programs. Even in the US, sustainability has become the thing to be, you know, but we're very bad at it, by the way. But I notice sustainability is a theme, particularly in European countries, you know, much less waste. Our culture, US, is very wasteful. Mm-hmm. Yes. How do you do this? Okay.
Okay, I would also like to thank you for a very wonderful and vivid lecture. And my name is Maria Selak. And
say it again.
Selak.
Yeah.
And I also come from University of Zagreb.
Okay.
From Faculty of Philosophy.
Okay.
Okay. I would also like to ask two questions as my colleague.
Everybody's two.
Not to ask more and not
Yeah.
to ask less. Okay, so first question would refer to the first part of your lecture, where you said that in this kind of trying to overcome the division between particularism and universalism, and trying to find any principle that is independent of a cultural context. I would like to ask you if we are trying to find this kind of universality in diversity, could it be precisely with the use of cultural context as just not only scientific but non-scientific approach, right, that we could come to this universality?
Yes.
Meaning not independent from cultural context, right, but precisely with its cultural context. That is my first question. And my second question is more connected to the second part of your lecture, and with the ethics of care. And you were discussing how to enable us to care. And in this part you discussed some kind of terms like responsibility, etc. And I would like to ask you what is with the other person, not in subject-object relation, but in subject-subject relation, meaning precisely with the one that we are taking care of. Mm-hmm. And if in these terms we are discussing our responsibility towards the one that we are taking care of, this one that needs to accept our care, could we discuss in these terms, especially when we are discussing autonomy on one hand and kind of paternalism on the other, maybe the notion of trust, which I believe is very neglected, as the notion that is opening the one that needs to be taken care of towards the one that is taking care of him.
Very good. These questions are all very good. Let's go back to the first one, which was what concept was that I was looking for. I think it's once again back to the idea of basic human needs, that's the recognition of need that is fundamental in ethics, and that's something we all share. We need certain things in order to be able to function, like we need a good environment, or and so on. With respect to your second question about whether we're doing things from the perspective of the caregiver or the care receiver, I happen to totally agree with you that trust is fundamental. Recently I gave a lecture on a book that's been published maybe 2 years ago in the US called The Immortal Life of Henrietta Locks. And it's about a black woman back in the 1930s, 1940s, whose, actually 1940s and 50s I should say, whose cells were used to grow this line of tissue that then became part of discovery of polio, how to treat that, of certain types of cancer and so on. And no one in her family knew that, no one was informed of it, and so on. but it kind of compounded the Tuskegee syphilis experiment in the US, which had been a study of the natural course of syphilis in a group of African American men. And even after there was a cure for syphilis, named penicillin, they didn't give the men the penicillin because they wanted to see the natural course, and it would ruin the experiment. So that was horrific. But it led to a fundamental mistrust that is still there among African Americans in particular towards the healthcare system. And so that if you don't have trust in a relationship, you can't get it off the ground. And especially in the intimate relationship, like caregiving and care receiving. Because if I can't trust you, how can I let you care for me? In other words, I have to trust the people here who are helping me, and I have to trust that they care enough about me before I give myself over to them. And the caregiver also has to be able to trust the care receiver, that they'll basically accept care and not give resistance to the care. And that demands a whole lot of trust on both people's part. It's a very good question. I think trust is a neglected virtue. And you know, there are many virtues that are neglected in the Western tradition. You know, a lot on courage, a lot on justice. I think trust and hope, you know, are neglected. Thank you.
Just one question, this really short one. How can we apply the principles of ethical care, and how can we, in some way, develop strategies not for ethical care to be seen as something that is not enough important, that is too abstract a problem, and that is not enough practical. It sounds so abstract to others, especially logic of dominance and mere theories.
Okay, I understand. That's the most difficult.
What can we do in our theories, in our disciplines, in all fields of thought, practical way of acting towards the world?
Right. I think that the hardest part for an ethics of care is moving it out of the private realm into the public realm, and to be able to see why care is more fundamental than justice. So what do? You have to have programs and policies that are attentive to what people actually need. Now, if you imported an ethics of care, you know, once again, you'd be addressing a problem like, let's say, structure in the workplace. If you were convinced and you really cared as much about women and old people and so on, you would create a workplace that was, once again, as I briefly mentioned, hospitable to the private realm and family life. Because if you set up a workplace that is in conflict with that, you are making it impossible, or not impossible, but very, very difficult to care. So the idea would be is for people who focus on ethics or that, to work with policymakers. That's why I wrote a book on ethics of public policy, to basically see what's wrong with their structures. Because sometimes it's a matter of blindness, or worse, it's a matter of just wanting to squeeze every ounce of strength out of people without taking account of they're not going to really be as good as workers they would be if they felt that you cared enough about their life. In the US, I've gotten to know a woman who has a construction company, and she has created policies and structures that let her workers, both men and women, do all of these kinds of things, take care of the parents, take care of this. She says her bottom line could be higher if she didn't do that. You know, she could make more money. But she says what she gets in terms of loyalty, of trust, of goodwill, of people ready to pitch in overtime is incredible. And so she felt that by creating the structures, You know, she did it, and the reason is she really is truly motivated by, well, if I don't have this structure, you know, Joe's going to go home and this and that's going to happen. That's when you care for people. Right. You have to put faces on it. You can't just use statistics.
Možda još vrlo kratko da pitanje.
I would like to, equally I'm very grateful to be invited to come. And one thing which...
And your name is, please?
Sonja Prodanović.
Yes, I should have remembered.
I'm an architect and urban planner, and I have been interested in involved in ecofeminist movement.
Yes.
One thing which impressed me very much here, as it is very relevant to our local situation, is this biomedical ethics, because we are now here in a rather breaking point of the whole social system.
Yeah.
This question of care and trust and justice is so much relevant in transitional chaos. One thing which for me would be very interesting is the role of technology in this mediation. For example, in reproductive rights, what is the relation to the technology in innovation to genetic modified organism? And I think here we are not at all aware of the bias of the technology, which really sort of cuts into straight ethical and sustainable development issues.
Right.
So,
right. Let's see. In the U.S. as compared to Europe, there's probably a more attitude that genetic engineering of crops and of food go ahead. I find in Europe there's more critical stance on that, whether that's the way to go, because of the way the seeding goes and so on and so forth, that it can ruin kind of livelihoods of people who are dependent on sort of natural crops, and that it sort of squeezes out those who can actually make a living on that type of farming or that type of harvesting. So that in a more caregiving world, maybe we would hold back a bit on that kind of application. Because once again, technology is a good tool, but it depends on the purposes we use the tool for. And whether, you know, I personally also think that much of the genetically enhanced food is actually awful. Like genetically enhanced tomatoes that look beautiful, but they don't taste like tomatoes. And, you know, all of that type of thing. So what are you getting? You're getting tomatoes that are easy to export, you know, because they come looking good, but they don't deliver on the promise. And that's sort of emblematic or a symbol to me of, you know, maybe we should take a step back. Also with technology, going back to the elder care and going back to the Japanese. Now this is really interesting to me, but it's culturally specific also. As I mentioned, the Japanese have a new emerging problem with care, but they are very resistant. Well, migrant care workers are all over the world, going from richer to poor, from poorer to richer countries. And that creates a disruption in the poorer countries who give up the people who could care for them in their poor countries and so on. So in Japan, though, they're very resistant to outsiders coming to care for them. They're really, well, fiercely Japanese. So they prefer machines and technology to do the caring. So a lot of monitors of people, a lot of devices to help them live alone, and visual screens that watch you all day long so that your family can tune into you. You know, I understand what that's about, but it really kind of defeats the purpose of caring. Having all those machines and people watching me, okay, so if I break my arm, they can get an emergency crew over there, but I'm not going to feel cared for, you know? I'm just going to feel like they wanted to handle me the easiest way they could. And this is making it easy for them. So, and also I'm interested in the fact that you're an architect, because at my university, one of the professors worked with the School of Architecture. Architecture. I'm having trouble speaking. And he was working on the design of institutions for elderly people or for people needing care. And that's how that whole thing called trying to remember the name of it, Eden. They call it, like, from the Garden of Eden, the kind of institution that has plants and lets there be small animals and a hospitable environment and a sense of, you know, having one's own space and just, you know, something like that. So there is a movement, you know, to try to do that, not just for rich people, you know, but for your average everyday people. I mean, in many of our institutions, what's so tragic about them is that the design about them, you know, narrow corridors, you know, here's the nurses, narrow corridors, the caregivers are situated away from you, all of that type of thing. And, you know, just if it was better design, and this is where the ecofeminism comes in the way that was hospitable to nature, you know, plants and, you know, animals, you know, not huge, you know what I mean, German shepherds or something like that, but, you know, small enough that they can be accommodated. They mean a lot to people, you know, I think so.